Thank you, Ariel, for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. Looking at this title, I don't think I need that. Looking at this title, I think the shorter title is a much better title. This sounds pretty darn boring, so apologies. That's the academic title of the paper that this is drawn from. But just to set the stage a little bit, let me start from the outset by saying this is a co-authored work with two folks at the University of Nairobi in Kenya. There's my colleagues. To set the stage here a little bit, I'll give you a cartoon and a quote, and I'll just give you a second to read that. So the cartoon is really focusing on something that you often hear in the water sector, and I'll tell you more about this issue in a second, but it's really focusing on children. The burden of resource collection on children in parts of the world where they don't have access to a grid for electricity and they don't have access to piped water. So they're collecting firewood, they're collecting water, and the question is that detracting from their ability to go to school and learn and develop human capital? So motivation number one for this paper is the burden of resource collection. And this is something that people have been studying for a while. A famous book in the water sector from the early 1970s drew attention to this. A more recent paper talking about how much time, billions of hours, are being spent by particularly women and girls collecting water in developing countries. So let me just try to give you a little more context to set the stage for what number are we talking about. You all drink water from a pipe connection at home. The majority of people who don't have piped access at home are in rural areas, most of them in sub-Saharan Africa. So right now the access number is about 54% of people in rural areas have access to what's called improved water sources. And I put it in air quotes because an improved source doesn't mean piped. It means it's a clean source for you to drink from. And it could be, in the definition, up to a 30-minute walk. So walking 30 minutes to get your water. So we don't know, actually there's not good data on how many people are walking to get water. But assume that 2/3 of these people who have improved access are walking. If you suppose that it works out to 31% of people in the world, 31% of people live in a household without piped water supply. Someone is walking to collect water. So about 1/3 of the world lives in a house where they have to actually go out and bring water home. Now, the other thing to note here is most people carry water in buckets or containers. Roughly 20 liters is a very common one around the world. That weighs about 50 pounds. So put 50 pounds on your back or on your head and walk 30 minutes to get water. It's a huge burden, okay? So that is the context. We want to understand more about this water collection burden. But now there's going to be one subtle change in this slide. See if you spot it. There's a question mark there. Why did I put a question mark there? In the water sector, there's also this story, this anecdote that you hear all the time in my world, that women like collecting water. If we invested in systems that would bring water to their house and save them time, they might not actually use it. They like collecting water because it gives them the ability to get out of the house, to socialize with their friends. So this is a widespread story. And so common, if you've seen this movie, Whiskey Tango Foxtrot, this anecdote is even made it into Hollywood. So Tina Fey is a journalist in Afghanistan. She's embedded with a military unit, and they have to keep coming back to this village over and over again because the well keeps getting blown up. And finally, the 3rd time she comes back, the women furtively pull Tina Fey's character aside and say, oh, it's us. We're the ones blowing up the well because we don't want the well. We want to get out of the house and walk to collect water. Okay? So the very simple question here is that true? In our particular site, do women like collecting water? So we're going to be able to talk about that. Okay, second motivation, if you're not that interested in water, a broader question. So what I'll call the work paradox. So if you follow any of this stuff in the newspaper, you know that there's all kinds of stuff written on how happy are people. And most of what we know from happiness research is based on simple questions that we can give people in big cross-country surveys. And those are typically what psychologists call evaluative questions. How happy are you with your life in general? How satisfied are you? And if you look at that literature, I'm just putting up this National Geographic as an example of the many, many things that are written about this. Places like Costa Rica score really high because they score high on these evaluative measures. And work, what's the nature of work? If you are unemployed, you're more likely to score low on these happiness measures. You're unhappy if you're unemployed. Employed people are happier. And it's not simply the income that work provides you. But there is another way of asking people about happiness that psychologists have been using for 40 years, but that is much harder to do. And it's called the experience sampling method. And it measures something called hedonic well-being, moment by moment. I don't want to ask you about your life overall. I want to say right now, how happy are you? And if you've heard of this at all, you would have heard of it through this book or this concept, flow, that surgeons and rock climbers, they get in the flow. They are so engrossed in what they're doing that if you ask them in the moment, it's the happiest that they possibly are. And this technique is essentially, it started in the 1970s by saying, I'm going to give you a pager. And when the pager goes off at some random time of day, I want you to fill out a short little survey. Who are you with? What are you doing? How happy are you? Okay? So this experience sampling method, this third method, hedonic, is actually quite similar to what economists originally conceived the measure of utility as. That's what Jeremy Bentham defined utility as. But it's not really common in economics. So here's the problem. Here's a recent article using the experience sampling method. And apologies, this is a little too small for you to read. I'll just read this for you. They looked at over 20,000 people who answered these experience sampling sort of methods in the UK. We find paid work is ranked lower than any of the other 39 activities individuals can report engaging in, with the exception of being sick in bed. Meaning people are miserable when they're at work. If you have a job, think about how happy you are at work. So one set of evaluative happiness measures say employment is very important, again, not just because of the income it provides, for a sense of life satisfaction. Another set of research says work makes people miserable. And so another contribution of what we're going to do with this paper is sort of say, is this true not for industrialized workers sitting in front of screens or working in retail or doing all the things that people do in those kinds of settings, but for, are they happy at work when work is farming, when work is collecting firewood, when work is collecting water? So, to summarize, and then I'll move on and give you an overview of what we're doing. Our questions here are Kenyans happy at work? This is the first paper that's ever tried to use this method in rural sub-Saharan Africa and anywhere in a non-industrialized setting. More broadly, we want to say, what's the opportunity cost of resource collection time? If you brought water closer and you freed up women's time, what's the thing that they would next spend their time on? If children didn't need to collect water at home, would they go to school more often? Would they spend more time studying? So there is some literature here. So one possibility, and the one that's often mentioned first, is, if women didn't have to collect water, they'd be able to take jobs. And those jobs would increase household income, and they could use that increased household income to pay water fees and pay for the infrastructure. There's not a lot of evidence of that. Only one study in Kyrgyzstan has found that so far, and it was really just farm labor. So that would be another way that if you worked on the family farm, you could increase yields, increase incomes, or at least increase the nutritional status of the household. But it's also possible that when you save that water collection time, you don't take a job, you don't work on the family farm, you do other household chores around the house, or you just relax. And that's not a bad thing. That's clearly a positive benefit. It's just harder for us as economists to put a dollar value on it compared to an increase in household income. Again, are children more likely to attend school? There's one study that's a panel study from Ghana showing that girls are more likely to attend school when their water points are closer. That's the only study that I know of out there. But there's nothing on the dimension of, do children spend more time studying? Because it's pretty hard to measure how many minutes they're studying at night. We can do that with our method. And then the other thing we want to sort of capture here is, what are these other impacts that we often read about in the literature on water collection, but there's not a lot of empirical evidence. So the first is happiness. I talked about that. There's another anecdote, but increasingly more evidence of this, that women, when they're out collecting water, are at risk of being attacked, a higher risk of being attacked. Obviously, if carrying 50 pounds on your back makes you tired, so we can measure their energy, not in a sort of kilojoule sense, but just how tired do you feel. It's painful. There's evidence of women carrying water having musculoskeletal injuries. And then finally, this question of, are women socializing more when they're collecting water? So I should also say, as an economist, I'm accustomed to being constantly interrupted. So if you would like to interrupt and have any, if you have any questions, that's perfectly fine. If you don't, that's also perfectly fine. I'm used to that too.
Are these related questions, or are they?
So I'm actually rolling two papers into one presentation. And so the first, the happy at work and the sort of the describing the method is one paper that's already under review. And the second is these latter two.
So these are three different sort of themes you are talking about.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. But it's two papers from the same field site, the same data collection exercise.
I will never do it again, but just one question. So all these impacts are direct impacts on the family, not indirect impacts on, let's say, the village or the rest of the society. Right?
So the question is, are we capturing anything that's beyond just the person who's collecting water, the more indirect measures on the community? And that's correct. We're not measuring any household level stuff. Sorry, village level stuff. Okay, so let me tell you about who we're talking to in our study site. So as you'll see in a moment, this was fairly intensive data collection. So our sample size is not huge. We talked to 220 households. We wanted to talk to a specific set of households. That's people who are walking to collect water, who they don't have water at home, and who have school-aged children. I'll also mention this is a site that we did work in 2 years before, so this is sort of panel in the sense that we're coming back and talking to them again, but I'm not using any of that data in this presentation. Who are we talking to? Who's the person who's going to do this experience sampling method that I'll tell you about? It's the person who spends the most time collecting water. So we go to the household and we say, who's the person in this household that spends the most time collecting water? Most of these households have multiple people collecting water, but the dominant story is mom is the main water collector. She spends the most time. That's 90% of the households. It's the person who collects the most water. She also makes decisions about, oh, daughter or son, could you run and go fetch a little bit more? I didn't get enough today. So it's very common that kids are also helping out collecting water, but they're not usually the main water collector. So you can see that this is a distribution of age. So the mean is 37, and you can see there's very few kids here under 20. The youngest was 16. They're not, this is a northeast Kenya, so education levels are not high. So of the women that I'm going to mostly be focusing on, 1/4 said they could read easily, 1/4, so that you'd call literate, 1/4 illiterate, and they can't read at all, and then 1/2 told us they couldn't read, or they could read but with difficulty, okay? So as you'll see, we have to incorporate that in how we ask the questions because we need to manage the fact that people are not literate. 40% of people worked for wages in the past week. So 40% work, that's good news in the sense of maybe seeing increased market work, but it's almost all farm work. It's working on my own farm, it's working on my neighbor's farm, sometimes for wages, sometimes for bargaining back and forth. Only 10% of people work in the formal sector. Average daily wages are $2.50, just to give you a picture here. We did 3 surveys. That's what baseline, midline, and endline. By surveys, I mean a enumerator, a trained interviewer that I was supervising would go to your house, sit down with you, have some tea, do a big, long survey, right? And so some of the data that we're using is from that. Most of what you'll see is from this experience sampling method. So I'll get to that in just a moment. So what is the experience of collecting water here? So let me just tell you, yes?
Did you pay the households for their time answering your questions?
Yes,
Okay.
not pay them directly in cash, but as you'll see, in quite remunerative benefits, such that we actually had a bit of a problem, as you could imagine when you're paying people who are randomly selected into a survey. If it's too remunerative, then the people who didn't get selected get mad. And so we had some issues with that. So let me just give you a picture of water collection. So 90% of people collect water every day. Okay? Almost everybody is queuing. So they spend, on average, 2.5 hours a day collecting water. And of that, about 40 minutes is queuing, waiting in line to collect water. Okay? So what I can't say is that this is a representative place for Kenya. I don't think it's far off. We don't have good national statistics on water collection times at Kenya. All we have is how long does it take you to go to the water point and come back, one-way walk times. You don't know how many trips they made, so you don't know how much time in total they spent. But I would argue that I don't think this is too far off, 2.5 hours a day. Most of these people, 3/4 of them, are carrying water home on foot. So if you've ever been in a place like this, you also can see people on bicycles collecting water. So that is true. There were about 1/4 were using bicycles. So you can carry 2 jerry cans on your bike, and then you hit the potholes really, really hard when there's like 90 pounds of water on your back wheel. A very small percentage of people would use a wheelbarrow or actually have animals with a cart. And then you can load up lots of cans of water in the back of the cart, and the animal pulls it for you. But that's a very small percentage. Okay, so back to our Tina Fey story. Do women like collecting water? So we're going to do lots of complicated things here to show you that they don't. But you could also just do this really simply and say, let's just ask them. So how much do you enjoy collecting water? We asked them this in the baseline survey. And the enumerators, the interviewers, said, please don't ask. This is a stupid question. They're going to laugh at us. Please don't ask this question. Of course they don't like collecting water. And they don't. And when I was sitting in interviews, the women would just laugh and say, of course I don't like collecting water. So 6% of people said they enjoy it a little bit or a lot, but the vast majority say I dislike collecting water.
How wide was the ordinal scale?
Those are the answer choices. That's it. Dislike it a lot, dislike it a little. How wide was the ordinal scale was the question. And what you're seeing are exactly the questions. Well, there's one more. I combined the last 2 categories, enjoy a little or enjoy a lot.
It wasn't like 0 to 10.
No. So we'll get that in the experience sampling. Yes? How many people were asked these questions is the question 220. A little more than that, 240 or so, and then some people dropped out. After I'll tell you the next bit, you'll see why they dropped out. Yeah?
Do you know if they go every day for collecting water, or if they go one time for a week or so?
Most people go every day. Yeah, most people go every day. Okay, so I'm going to take a minute now to show you what the experience sampling method looks like. This is the phone that we bought them. It's about a $20 phone in Kenya. It's a smartphone. We programmed it with an app called ODK, so the survey was custom designed by us. And we also put an app on there, a custom version of an app that would send you a random reminder 4 times during the day, Monday through Saturday. At 4 random times, your phone would beep, and it would say, complete the survey. And it's easiest just to show you what the survey looks like on the phone. So this is me in a dark room in my house filling out this survey. So here's the program. You have to hit, there's 2 surveys. We're going to talk about the time use survey first. I'll tell you the school children in a second. And remember, we have a complex literacy situation. 1/4 of people are literate. Many of those prefer to speak English, not to read in their native village. So what you see is a description of a question in Kimeru, the local language. I hit a button, and you can hear that read to you if you're illiterate. I just switched the language to English so that you can see it and just follow along, but also because many of our survey respondents wanted to do it in English. What's the secret animal? We were concerned that the wrong person, I'll tell you more about that in a second, it was a form of password. Think back to what you were doing when the phone buzzed. Which category below best describes the main thing you were doing? Scroll down to see the activities. So this is going to market. I'm just showing you here that there were subcategories for some of these time use activities. Work outside the home, was it unpaid work? Was it paid work? Paid work in the informal sector? Was it work in my own private business? Again, if you can't read, you can click the button and have someone read that description to you. So other work outside the home, not much of anything. Also something they didn't want me to ask. Farming, because nobody wants to admit that they had nothing to do and they were bored. School, reading, livestock, private. You don't want to tell me what you're doing, that's fine. Socializing, games and hobbies, sleeping, caring for children and others, household chores, cooking, cleaning, watching TV or the radio, attending meetings, collecting water, collecting firewood, bathing. So those are all the time use categories. We developed those partly to match international time use characteristics and partly to match what they actually do. How much did you enjoy doing this activity? A little, somewhat, very much. Was this activity important to you? Sorry to be reading to you, but I'm not sure if you can see it that well in the back. Do you wish you had been doing something else? So this is a measure of agency. Now, were you doing something else at the same time? A secondary activity, and these are the exact same categories. These time use categories, by the way, were randomized. The order in which you saw them was randomized so that you couldn't always just choose the first one. And again, why were you doing this other activity? Who was with you when your phone buzzed? Alone, a friend. In the last hour, did you feel any physical pain in your body? None, slight, bothersome, or severe. Did you feel unsafe in the last hour? Very unsafe to very safe. How happy were you feeling right now when the phone buzzed? On that scale, very happy to very sad. How lonely or sociable are you feeling on the same 7-point scale? How tired or energetic are you feeling right now? This is standard, the way psychologists ask these questions. We had a psychologist look at it. And you save the form, and the next time that your phone is connected to the internet, it automatically sends the data to us. So I log into my computer back in Washington State, and I can check the data. So that's the experience sampling method in a nutshell. Again, this happened 4 times a day. And you might say, is this data garbage? So the next slide here is to show you whether we think this data is not garbage. So panel A shows you the submissions over time. So they kind of ramp up, stay fairly constant, and then drop off again. Panel B shows you how many, on average, submissions did we receive per day. And you can see the average is hovering a little below 3.5, meaning people were not doing 4 a day. They were ignoring some of them, which you would expect, and which people in the industrialized countries do too. Sometimes you ignore it. Time of day, we see distributed throughout the day, so we don't think people are just doing it at particular times of day that are convenient to them. Again, they're spaced fairly evenly through the week, Monday through Saturday. And the average, I'm blanking on the average, but it was on the order of 4 or 5 minutes to complete the survey, as you can imagine from having just watched it. Okay? And then the second survey, just really, sorry, I'm doing 2 computers at once. The second survey was different. It was not experience sampling method. It was the same smartphone, a different program. And we asked the parents to tell us what happened to their kids that day. So for every school child in your household, if you have 4 kids, I want you to complete this survey 4 times. And I want you to tell me, did he or she attend school today? Self-reported. What kinds of chores did he or she do today? And this is every day, Monday through Friday during school days. How many minutes did he or she spend studying in those categories? We just take the midpoints of those ranges. And then I match those names back to what we have from the baseline survey, and so we can try to answer this question of kids and water collection. So let's go back to the first question. Are rural Kenyans happy at work? Again, what we know from industrialized countries is people are miserable. If you do these surveys when they're at work, if I made you do the survey right now, you'd probably go, oh my God, I wish I was doing something else. This is terrible. You're supposed to say, no, this is very interesting. Got none of that. Okay, so the first thing that we might want to talk about is time use here. So this gives us a measure of time use. What you're doing when the phone buzzes at random is a probabilistic statement on how you spend your time. If you spend 100% of your time watching TV, then 100% of my random beeps are going to find you watching TV. If you spend half your time watching TV and half studying, then you'd think, probabilistically, half the time the ESM survey will find you studying and half watching TV. So we're going to back out time use based on the probability of you reporting a specific activity when the phone buzzes. So you can see this is among the water collectors, the main water collectors who are doing this survey, 220 of them, 3,258 time use records for this sample before September 8th. Mostly what they're spending time doing is household chores. Household work is the most common thing that they do. I converted it into minutes with this red line, shows you an hour. Okay, so you can see, again, the collecting water is about 2 hours. That's a little less than the number I told you before when we just asked them directly. But a fair amount of time socializing, farming, et cetera, et cetera. Paid formal labor is way down here at the bottom. Sports and hobbies we mostly put in for kids, and there's not many kids.
So household work is just household chores, right? Because you have a separate category, own farming. So if they're working on their own lot or in a self-employed business, that would not be counted under household work.
Yeah, so the question is, how do we define household work? What categories go into it? And yes, it's true that what's considered household work is sort of how we would think of household work: cooking, washing dishes, cleaning around the house, tidying around the house. Things like working on your farm are their own category of farming. Going to work for somebody else formally is formal paid labor. Collecting firewood is a separate activity, et cetera. So I'm showing you this now because I'm going to use household chores as the reference category that we compare things to, for the number one reason that it's the most common activity. So the second thing is you might say, okay, well, let's look at just the raw data. How happy were people by the activity that they reported doing when the phone buzzed? And these aren't ordered, so it's hard to look at, but it'll get easier in a minute. So this is just raw. There's no statistics here besides a raw confidence interval. So you can see household, let's see, where's household work? Is kind of in the middle here. So I'm going to argue that it's also kind of a mid-range activity for happiness, which is why I'm going to drop it as the reference category so that everything will be compared to happy compared to what? Happy compared to doing household chores. Okay? So this is just the raw data. And the other thing to note on this slide is that, remember, we asked on a 7-point scale from very sad to very happy. We just recode that to a 0 to 100 scale. So whenever you see these results, you're going to be interpreting them as like there are percentage changes in happiness. They're not exactly percentages. They're just a recoded scale. But I just want to sort of explain how to interpret them. And remember our other measures. Let me skip this in the interest of time. We just saw it. Pain, safety, agency, etc. There's only 2 slides with equations. This is just an econometric specification slide. And the key thing here, in the lingo, we'd say this is a fixed effects model. What that essentially means is, you take 2 people. One of them's a really happy person. One of them's a really sad person. Okay, well, the really happy person is going to be saying happy much more of the time, right? But that's not what we're interested in. We're interested in controlling for how happy you are overall. How much does the specific activity kind of goose your happiness up or down? Okay? So what we're going to do is there's a sort of intercept term, that's this alpha term, that's capturing on average, how happy are you. And then what we want to see is the sort of deviations away from that person-specific average. Okay? And then we also put in 2 controls for whether you're alone, because that might affect happiness, and the time of day. Because there's evidence from the earlier studies I showed you that people are happiest in the morning, and then it tends to, as they get tired and work's grinding them down, they tend to feel less happy as the day goes on. Okay, so I'm going to show you a couple of these graphs, so let me talk you through what you're looking at on this first one, and then we'll go faster on the others. This is a statistical model. This is not raw data. This is the coefficient that comes out of the model I just showed you. So this is the predicted change in happiness compared to household work, which is the red line, by activity. Okay? And these are ordered. So things that made you less happy than household work are at the top, and things that made you more happy are at the right. The bar is showing you a confidence interval on the coefficient estimate. 90% is the thicker line, and if you can kind of see there's a whisker that gets a little less thick, that's the 95% confidence interval. So what we're looking for is when these confidence intervals don't overlap with the red line. Then we can say statistically, there's a statistically significant difference between happiness during this activity and household work. So on this slide, first of all, you can see clearly less happy collecting water compared to household work. But most of the things in the upper bar there are work. They're work that households do in rural sub-Saharan Africa. Casual labor, farming, collecting firewood, formal labor. So confirms the hypothesis that, yes, rural Africans also are not happy at work, right? There's one little caveat to that story that even in industrialized countries we haven't seen, which is we find that people who are working in their own business, people who are entrepreneurs, maybe they have a small shop selling airtime or water, those people actually said they were more happy than household chores. So there's a subset, and you can see it's not quite significant at the 90% level, but it's close. And partly that's driven by the fact that so few people are actually doing those kinds of entrepreneurial activities.
So, quick question.
Yes.
For your fixed effects regression, so you I know you contacted people 4 times a day.
Yeah.
And how many observations do you have to estimate the fixed effects?
So the question is, how many observations per person did we collect over the whole period to estimate? That's basically the sample that you have to estimate given the fixed effects. And I don't have the number off the top of my head, but it's on the order of hundreds, low hundreds.
You did contact them over several days.
Oh, I'm sorry, I never mentioned this. The question was, did you contact them over several days? This was over 8 weeks.
Oh, 8 weeks, 4 times a day.
4 times a day.
Oh, so you have hundreds of observations.
6 days a week. Yeah, 8 weeks. Now that varies. Some individuals were very diligent and did it 3 or 4 times a day. Some less, but that's the basics. Okay, quickly these other graphs because they're not super central, and I want to leave time for the second part of the talk. How energetic did you feel compared to household chores? All right, collecting water again. I'm less energetic than household chores. Farming, I'm tired at night. Paid formal labor, collecting firewood. So the resource collection work tires you out. Nothing surprising there, but it actually gives you some confidence that this data is not garbage, that people are giving us good information. How sociable were you feeling? All right, well, here, when I told you that I'm alone, that's the least sociable I'm feeling. That makes sense. When I'm doing something private, I'm not feeling very sociable. And here, collecting water, again, is not necessarily more social than household chores. And then safety. Do people feel unsafe when they're out collecting water? Again, we see a statistically significant difference between collecting water and household chores. It makes some sense when you're doing household chores, you're at home, so you feel some degree of safety. I should also note there's another paper, I'm blanking now, it's out of Latin America, showing that women who were victims of domestic assault were actually more likely to take paid labor because they were trying to get out of the household. So I want to caution that it could go the other direction depending on what's going on in the household. Yeah. And then pain. How much pain were you in? Again, now to the right means more likely to report that whatever I'm doing right now is causing me pain. So farming, casual labor, collecting water, collecting firewood, these are all things that are painful. So here's some evidence that resource collection, particularly water collection, is not a sociable activity in our site. It's not enjoyable. Women didn't like doing it. It was tiring and painful, and it was perceived as more unsafe than many other activities. So we mostly confirm this paper that I showed you the abstract of in the beginning, Happy at Work, that yes, rural Kenyans don't seem that much different than 20,000 people in the UK. They're also not very happy at work. Okay. So now let's talk about the second set of questions. What's the opportunity cost of collection time? So what I'm going to describe to you here is an experiment that we did. And here's the basics of the experiment. I need to get you, if you're a household spending 2.5 hours a day, I need you to spend any time collecting water and then see what you do with your time. Right? So how do I do that? Well, maybe I could bring you piped water. Well, that's pretty expensive and requires a lot of planning. And so it's really hard to figure out how you're going to sort of randomly choose people and randomly reduce their water collection times to 0. So what we did is we hired water vendors. So we hired people who can deliver water to your house, like milk delivery people of old. And if you're in the treatment group, you get 20 liters per capita per day. That's what LCD means. So you tell us your household size, we'll give you 20 times that amount. And we have to give you a new storage container to make sure you actually have enough water to store that much. So that's what the black storage container is you see. If you're the control group, you get cooking oil, which is a valuable commodity. You also, didn't mention this, but we gave them an incentive for each survey that they filled out. Very, very small. And we also gave them airtime, so that they never had to pay for airtime to submit these surveys. The other thing I should mention is because there's no electricity, we had to give them solar chargers to keep the phones charged. And the solar chargers also just came with a little light. That was just the one that we bought. So everybody in both the control and the treatment group now has an electric light in their house. You're spending less money on kerosene because you have a solar charger in your home, right? So those are all incentives for the control group to not get super pissed off that they didn't happen to get selected for free water. Yeah.
How expensive was this all? Like buying all the resources?
The whole study was like $150,000, and this stuff was a significant part. The biggest part was actually paying for water vending, as I'll show you in a second.
So these were both water and the oil were distributed free.
Sorry?
They were distributed free of charge to the individual.
The water and the oil were distributed free of charge.
Isn't the oil, is it 100 liters of oil too?
No. You can see the container. It's a 1.5 liter. And they got another one at the end. The control group got another thing of a second container of oil, and they also got the storage container at the end, just to be fair. So people were generally happy with this experiment. So here is their plan. I'm showing you the submissions of the ESM survey over time. So we're going to do these randomization meetings. Everybody comes to a central place. They draw random numbers out of the hat, decide if they're control or treatment. And then we start delivering free vended water to the treatment group, and we see what happens. How do they spend their time? Are they happier? Are they more energetic? What this involved is hiring a tanker truck from Nairobi, 4 hours away, partnering with the local water utility, which is who owns the tank that you see these men standing on. And we had a contract with the local water utility that our vendor truck would come up once a day and fill up from their storage container. Then they would go deliver the water. Well, they locked the gate when we didn't expect it. And that pump failed for the first couple days. Because the streets are not paved, these trucks would really get into trouble on narrow, unpaved streets. So we had to hire a whole fleet of bicycle vendors. So the bicycle vendors, you can see them would follow the truck. The truck would go on the main road, and then the bicycle vendors would fill from that container and then go bicycle into the lanes and deliver it to the treatment households. Okay? They quickly learned they had us over a barrel, so to speak, and started, not showing up, wanting higher wages. So that was another problem we had to deal with. And then things happen in fieldwork like this. The truck got a flat tire and was stuck. So we had a bunch of people that were expecting water to come to their house because we told them that we were going to deliver the water. They didn't collect water that day, and suddenly nobody shows up. So this was a disaster. So this is what it actually looked like. Utter chaos for a few days. And then we started to get things worked out. We were getting a system working. Most of the households were starting to get water delivered to them that were supposed to have water delivered. And then we realized the real constraint was the second tanker. We just had to spend the money to hire a second water tanker, bring it up from Nairobi, and then things started working. So treatment really became pretty clear for that last 2.5 weeks. Things were working well. So that means there's 3 definitions of treatment that we could use. One is to drop people only from that chaotic 2 or 3 days. The second is to be really conservative and only use from the green arrow over when we knew everything was working correctly. But that means we throw out a lot of data. So what I'm going to show you here is we had them keeping careful records of who was getting water delivered and when. So essentially what I'm going to do is when a treated household was not actually treated, we just dropped them from the data for that day. We just dropped those records. So your treated household records come back in whenever that we have an indication they're actually getting water. I'm going to skip this just to move us along. I can come back to it because I want to leave time for more questions. this is the same version of the model that you saw before. It's a fixed effects model, so we're still looking at variations at the household level. And the only difference here is now we have a treatment variable. So we just want to see how does treatment change these things. So now I'm not going to show you a pretty picture of the coefficients, but I'll talk you through what these estimates mean. So here is the treatment variable. This is on the happiness scale. Remember, 0 to 100. How happy was the control group over this time period? 78.5. So the being in the treatment group, getting water delivered to you, increased your happiness 3 points on that scale. So not dramatic, but statistically significant. No change in sociability, the sociability scale. So we didn't find that women who were now getting water delivered were feeling less sociable. They were feeling more lonely. No change at all on that. More energetic, 4 points on that 100-point scale. And this is from a much lower base. They felt more safe. And this is a different, no, that's a linear probability. So that's also 8 percentage points less likely to say that they were in pain. So all things that should not be at all surprising given the first half of the talk, right? That I showed you that water collection is associated without any sort of treatment or experiment with being tired, being not very happy, being in pain, et cetera. So when we reduce that water collection time, sure enough, we see increases in those. So the stuff that's a bit more interesting to the economists is what activities are the opportunity costs here? What do you do with the new time that you have? So again, I'll walk you through this a little carefully at first. So first of all, what's the probability that you are collecting water in the control group during this period? 12.4% of the ESM records found the control group collecting water. If you convert that to minutes, that means that the control group was spending on average 116 minutes a day collecting water. How does the treatment affect that? It reduces it by 10.4 percentage points. So not to 0. If this was 0.124, then the treatment would have been completely successful and we completely eliminated all water collection. We didn't. They still collected some water, right? But it did a pretty good job of reducing it from 12% to 10%. And what I calculate here is the treatment effect in minutes. So what you can say is, on average, our treatment of having water delivered saved households 96 minutes a day. Okay? And that's just, did it work? The next question is, what goes up? What do they spend more time on? So the next three in red are the three things that we see a statistically significant increase in time. Household work, 45 minutes increased treatment effect, 25 minutes to leisure, and 20 minutes to farming. So we do see a little bit of income generating activity, or at least better subsistence farming, because we see some time devoted to farming. So this is like the study I mentioned in Kyrgyzstan. But like other studies from urban areas, we don't see increases in, say, paid work here. These are all 0. This is why I'm not highlighting them. We see mostly time spent on other household chores. So there's a paper in the American Economic Review did this in urban Morocco, and they found mostly the time went to other household chores.
Excuse Joe, does household work include childcare?
It does not. Does household chores include time care?
No,
Child care, sorry, and it does not. Caring for others is child care.
Oh, okay.
Yep. So no change in. This is all I should mention, primary activity. I haven't analyzed whether secondary activities change, so it's possible. Yeah.
And this is based on the last 2 weeks of the data set that you showed us, or this is based on 6 weeks?
So what's the time frame is the question that this data is based on. It's based on roughly the last 4 weeks. Because what I'm showing you, let me go back to this graph. One definition is only to use from the green arrow over. I think that's overly conservative, so we're using data from here forward. So it's about 4 weeks, yeah.
So, are you concerned about long-term effects, sort of?
Yeah.
Because if you have more time, like in a month, you don't know what to do with it, but if you have more time for a year or so, then you start thinking about jobs or other things.
Got it, yeah. Absolutely. So the question was, are you concerned with short versus long run things? That if you just happen to have a couple extra hours just for a certain amount of time, you're not going to go take a new job because you know that that's going to this treatment thing is going to end. So for sure, that's on the last slide that I have that is a concern of ours. And the original research design had an arm where we would buy them a giant rainwater collection tank that would fulfill all their needs for long term. It was just too expensive, and we couldn't get power. I mean, we'd be able to do it for like 10 households because each one of those systems is like $1,500. So we had to cut that. It's a good question. Okay, let me just about done. We haven't talked about kids. So what about kids? Remember, this is from that other survey where I said, tell me about your kids and what they were working on. Did they go to school? So in the control group, 82% of kids, the parents reported that they went to school today. Right? So this is not a setting where nobody's going to school. School attendance is quite high. I'm not going to vouch for what they're learning, but kids are actually going to school at pretty high rates. 82% of kids are going to school. But the treatment effect does increase that. Again, remember, these kids are only indirectly benefiting from the treatment. Their moms are the ones who are really having their water collection time saved. There's only one kid, I think, that was a school-age kid who was actually doing the ESM surveys. So we see stool attendance go up by 14 percentage points, which is pretty large. Again, that's been shown in other studies. This part is newer. So because we actually ask these sort of detailed questions every single day, we ask them how much time did the kids spend studying. So on average in the control group, we see kids are spending about an hour studying. And it's not big, but it's statistically significant, and it's not to be written off. 8 extra minutes a day studying. I should also note that this 55 minutes might be higher because we gave them electric lights to study at night. So it could be that they spent much less time in the control group, say 30 minutes, and because now they can read at night because they have a light, that went to 55 in the control group. But what I'm really measuring here is the difference between the treatment and the control group. And then last slide here is what about chores? So indeed, kids are spending some time collecting water. So 31% of kids in the control group collected water that day. But our treatment worked. Kids were much less likely to spend time collecting water. They didn't do that as a chore. Again, it doesn't go to 0. It's not 0.31 and 0.31, but it reduced it pretty substantially. So what did kids spend their time doing when they didn't have to collect water? Well, you don't see that not having any chores, it goes up. So it's not like, oh, great, you don't have to do anything today. Go study, go relax, go talk to your friends. No, it's help me with cleaning, help me with cooking. So the percentage of kids who had to do other household chores goes up when the water collection chores go down. So our conclusions, in the short run, when households have these water collection times reduced to 0, we see the water collector says she's happier, more energetic, more safe, but no change in sociability. So kind of matching the first set of results. About an hour and a half of time savings for water collection. And the majority of that goes to other household chores, cooking, cleaning, washing around the house, but a substantial amount to leisure and on-farm labor. Children in the household, school attendance goes from 82 to 96%. Time studying goes up 14%, and some of that chore time is reallocated to other things. So concerns, unblinded treatment is one. It might be that households knew they were in the treatment group, and the control group knew they were in the treatment group. They knew nobody was delivering water, and so they were more likely to say, I hate collecting water. I'm really unhappy when the water collection comes. I can't rule that out, that people knew, in some sense, the objective of the study. The other thing that we do have data on, but it's on the list of to-dos before this paper goes out for review, is, as you can imagine in a small community, your neighbor gets free water delivered, and you don't, and you're buddies. And your neighbor might say, hey, I'll do you a solid. I'll give you some of this free water we're getting, right? Which could explain why we don't see water collection times go to 0 for the treatment group. And it also would mean the control group actually also had their water collection times drop a little bit. So we asked people about that. We told them, please don't do it. But if you do it, just tell us who you're doing. So we can match bilaterally who's sharing with whom, who in the treatment group and who in the control group. But it's kind of a nightmare to analyze, as you can imagine. The concern of short-run and long-run impacts that we've already discussed. And then the other really big thing to mention here is seasonality. We deliberately did the study in the dry season when water is the scarcest. And it's very hard to find places to collect water. So that's when water collection burdens are highest. It also happens to be the time when nothing's really happening in the agricultural cycle. So it's a time that there's not a lot of farm work to do. So on one hand, it was the highest water collection burden, but the lowest sort of opportunity cost of time because there wasn't that many ag activities to do. So it could very well be the case that if we did this in the rainy season, we'd get very different results. So this was funded by the Swedish International Development Agency through a fabulous network I'm part of called the Environment for Development Initiative. So major thanks to them. And then Shireen Tabrizi and Victor Most were sort of running things on the ground, and it took a whole fleet of people, as you saw, to carry this off. So it's all to them that I'm standing here. And I'll leave it there and have a couple more minutes for questions.
So what would happen when like the households wouldn't get their water delivered in that one time where like you were delivering it? Like I know that you said that water, like they still collected some water, but like did you like hear some pushback or like how did that go?
Oh, yeah. We heard pushback. People were pissed. People were pissed. I mean, they essentially went and collected water. Like, suppose I go every morning and I collect water, right? And then you tell me, foreign guy who's coming in here and promising me the moon, that you're going to bring me water at 11:30 in the morning. Nobody shows up. I wait till 3. I wait till 4. Nobody's coming. I got to go get water to cook dinner. So I don't know this because we were way busier trying to figure out how to fix the problem. But certainly I heard people were mad and they were just going back to collect water in their normal ways. That's why we just basically dropped data from those days. Sorry, I forgot to repeat the question there.
So I have a question which is related to my question about indirect effects. So you know that Kenya is one of the famous countries that produce marathon runners, right? And I had a good friend from Kenya, Joe Wambia, and he told me, you know, Ariel, the reason that we have such good marathon runners is because we run to collect water, we run to collect wood, we run to school, we always run.
Yeah.
So what would happen to the production of marathon runners in Kenya if all Kenya people will have access to water? You know, this is something I need to think about.
Maybe. Yeah, so the question is, you know, let me rephrase that question because I've heard a variant of this in other presentations. You know, that it's actually a good thing that people have to collect water, that it's good for you. I mean, another version of that question was, you know, if obesity is a problem, as it is in lots of countries, maybe it's good that people have to carry 50 pounds home. And your question is, you know, is it going to reduce the supply of Kenyan marathon runners? No, I mean it's a good question, and it's I take your point.
I don't think obesity is a big problem in Kenya.
Obesity is not a big problem here, and this is not where the marathon runners are from. They're from Kisumu, Kericho. They're from the highlands. Yeah, these aren't the high parts.
But what is the? I mean, it looks like they are diverting a lot of their freed up time in household chores. What are these household chores? Because most of these, they have very small houses, and did you get a feel for what these household chores are? I mean, are there so many household chores that they were being sacrificed to when people were out collecting water? I'm sort of a little puzzled by people spending their freed up time in household chores. Yeah,
so the question is, what are these household chores that are taking up so much time, to paraphrase for the camera? I don't know that I can answer that because it was just this one category that we took a lot of care and focus groups to figure out how to define it correctly. And we can pull up actually, let's just do that. I can pull up the list of all the things that are included. I mean, it's true people had small houses, but they also had larger, that's not the right computer. They also have big families. So, cooking for a big family, cleaning up after a big family. Oops, I passed it. But I'll show you the description, but I'm not sure I'm going to give you a very compelling answer. So household chores. Oh, it's cut off. Time spent on household chores like preparing meals or tea, pounding grain, or shelling beans. Those can be pretty time-consuming. Sweeping, washing dishes and utensils, washing clothes.
But washing clothes is tricky
And
because
tidying.
now you have water to wash your clothes.
That's right, yeah. I mean, a lot of the time
So
spent
there's
is
a
getting the
spillover
water.
there.
But it's still, I mean, if you're still washing in a, I don't know how often you've ever had to do that, but I haven't very often. But it is pretty time-consuming to wash them by hand. So
Could you have looked at, instead of asking children, looking at children spending more time studying, is there any way to sort of look at school attendance? Whether
So-
that improved?
So that's also on the to-do list. So what we have and what I showed you is self-reported school attendance. And parents are telling us their kids are more likely to go to school. But there's also a lot of doubt about self-reported school attendance. So we actually also went back and got the attendance logs from the principals for the study period. And again, it's just a nightmare matching all these names that are spelled 4 different ways with a formal attendance logbook. So that's another thing that's on the to-do list.
Just one more question. Can you tell us a little bit about the training for the households for the surveys? Because it looks a little bit complicated, even with the reading questions.
Training for the households.
For doing the surveys, yes.
For the interviewers or for the households to do the thing on the phone?
Yeah.
It was so the question is, what training did you have to do to get the households to actually do these surveys?
Yeah.
And so that was done during the baseline survey. And it took 30 minutes to sort of sit down. The enumerator would do a survey with them, then they would hand the phone, have them do a survey. And of course, the really nice thing about this data is it's coming in real time. So we're sitting back, in the hotels in town every night looking at the data and saying something looks wrong. They submitted 4 records, right on top. So there was some process of going back and helping them, but it was mostly in that baseline survey. But it's not that complicated, honestly. I think people mostly got it pretty quickly. I think we better, happy to take yours afterwards. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you for the invitation.